All right, so here we go. I'm Terry Camerzell, and I'm here on behalf of Creation Fellowship Santee. We're a group of friends who love to learn about our Creator God and believe the Bible, when read properly, rules out the possibility of long ages. We met for 10 years at the Creation and Earth History Museum in Santee, California. Then and online, our goal is to equip believers to defend their faith. You can find almost 5 years worth of our virtually there archives by visiting tinyurl.com/CFS archives. That's C like creation, F like fellowship, S like Santee, and the word archives. Although our focus is creation science, sometimes we like to highlight the consequences in our culture of evolutionary thinking. Alex Newman is an award-winning international journalist, educator, author, and consultant. He is the founder and CEO of the Liberty Sentinel and one of our favorite speakers for this category of talk. Previously, he has spoken for us about the biblical basis for only one race, as well as the dangers of transhumanism. Tonight, he is delivering part one of our two-part series on secular humanism. His focus is the public school agenda. With that, I'm happy to turn it over to you, Alex.
Well, thank you very much. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here with you guys again. Really appreciate all that you guys are doing. And so I was asked to talk about humanism and the nexus with public schools. And so we'll go through a little bit of what the humanists themselves have said, and I would argue that you can't understand humanism without understanding the role of the public school system, and you can't understand the public school system without understanding the humanism. And I think the evidence for this is overwhelming. So we'll just do real informal. If you guys want to stop me, ask a question, happy to do it. I'll talk for a little bit. I've got a few slides that I'll share with you, and then depending on where we want to go, maybe bring in some other stuff. But let me see if I can share my screen here. Let's do screen two. And then let me turn this slideshow into a slideshow. All right. So we'll start with slideshow. All right. So can you guys all see that?
Yes, we can.
Okay, fantastic. So we'll start with John Dewey. He was actually one of the founders of the religious humanist movement. He was one of about 30 individuals who wrote the Humanist Manifesto. And he was also almost universally acknowledged as the founding father of the public school system in America. I think in fairness, he deserves to share some of the blame for that with some others, people like Horace Mann and Robert Owen. If we have time, maybe we can get into a little bit about what they believed. Their views were actually remarkably similar to humanism, although they did not use that term. But all of them have some things in common, including a total and absolute rejection of God's word, a total rejection of the existence of God as we know him through his word. And Dewey had a very comprehensive worldview. And he wanted to see a major transformation, not just of American society, but of humanity itself. And he believed humanism was the vehicle to do that. Politically speaking, he was very much in favor of socialism. When you read his writings, he wrote a huge number of books. I have most of them in my library. You'll often find the word democracy used interchangeably with socialism. So when you're reading his work, it helps a lot to understand what he meant by democracy. But his guiding light for what he thought American society ought to look like actually came from a book called Looking Backward by Edward Bellamy, a very prominent socialist in that era. It was published in 1888. And so Dewey said he wanted a new social order. And if you read this novel, Looking Backward, it was a fantasy. It was a novel about a communist America in the year 2000, where private property and the family would be abolished, which of course is right in line with the goals of the humanists. In another one of it, we'll get to the Humanist Manifesto that he co-authored in just a moment. But again, he was very clear on what he wanted. In his paper, Liberalism and Social Action, he said that the only form of enduring social organization now possible is one in which the new forces of productivity are cooperatively controlled. If that sounds like Karl Marx, good, because that's exactly what Karl Marx was advocating, right? The means of production should be owned by the people or the state. He said organized social planning is now the sole method of social action by which liberalism can realize its professed aims. And he understood, of course, that education was the key to bringing about these objectives that he had. He viewed education very differently than we would as Christians. And if we do have time later, I may get into a little bit about the difference between the Christian understanding of education and the human humanist understanding of education. They are fundamentally incompatible. And this might be a good place to stop and just remind everybody that twice in the Gospels, Jesus is quoted saying, "You're either with me or against me." And that leaves notice no middle ground, and I would argue that it lumps all things that are not specifically with God into the anti-God category. So whether you're looking at humanism or Islam or Marxism or any of these other worldviews, paganism, it really doesn't matter. They're all in the anti-God category. So, I think humanism is a subset of this movement, and I think that'll become clearer as we go through the Humanist Manifesto. One of the things he also said was that his view of education, it's a regulation of the process of coming to share in the social consciousness, right? As Christians, we normally think of individual consciousness, not social consciousness. But he says adjustment of individual activity on the basis of social consciousness is the only sure method for social reconstruction. And he said education is the process through which this transformation that he wanted to see could be brought about. He did outline a plan to dumb down the American people. That's an incredible essay that he published in 1898 called The Primary Education Fetish, where he argued that we really didn't need to teach all these kids all this reading and writing and math. What they really need, he said, is collectivism, right? We need to teach them to become part of the collective and to subordinate their interests to the collective. And he did acknowledge that change would have to come gradually because to force it unduly would compromise its final success by favoring a violent reaction. So this is the language of a conspirator, right? This is the language of someone who knows he's doing something wrong, someone who knows and therefore is doing it in secret, which is the very definition of a conspiracy. Two or more people working in secret for nefarious, illegal, immoral purposes or intent. So this is a very, very clear effort to dumb down the population. He actually teamed up with the Rockefeller clan. Really, really interesting. He got a grant, $3.1 million by the General Education Board, which is a Rockefeller philanthropy, and they set up an experimental school at the University of Chicago. They actually got the huge money. And the guy who ran this General Education Board that was funding John Dewey was named Frederick T. Gates. And he said some really incredible things about what they wanted to do with the education system as well. This is a direct quote from his writing. He says, "In our dream, we have limitless resources, and the people yield themselves with perfect docility to our molding hand. The present educational conventions fade from our minds, and unhampered by tradition," which he's talking here about Christianity and the long history we had of Christian education, "we work our own goodwill upon a grateful and responsive rural folk. We shall not try to make these people or any of their children into philosophers or men of learning or of science." Interesting. He says, "We are not to raise up from among them authors, orators, poets, or men of letters. We shall not search for embryo great artists, painters, musicians, nor will we cherish even the humbler ambition to raise up from among them lawyers, doctors, preachers, politicians, statesmen, of whom we now have ample supply." Right? They wanted dumbed down worker drones to work in Rockefeller's factory. So that brings me to the Humanist Manifesto. The Humanist Manifesto is an incredibly significant document. It's not very well known or understood today, but I believe it set in motion one of the most profound transformations we have ever seen in human history. It really was the foundation for changing America from a free, Christian-based biblical system of government to a radically new system. And so it was published in 1933. It had 34 signers when it was originally published, including John Dewey and quite a few of his associates. And I want to start here with the very beginning. Well, even before we get to the first tenet of the Humanist Manifesto, there's actually a preface on it as well. And I want to quote from the preface. Again, this was signed by John Dewey, right? One of the most instrumental people behind this thing. He says that they said the time has come for widespread recognition of the radical changes in religious beliefs throughout the modern world. The time is past for mere revision of traditional attitudes, right? They wanted radical transformation, especially when it came to our religious views or our the way we answer the profound and significant questions in life, including the really big ones, right? Where did we come from? Why are we here? Was there a meaning to life, right? Where do we go when we die? He thought we needed to throw out the old and come in with the new. And so there have been subsequent versions of the Humanist Manifesto that have been released since the original one in 1933. But let's start with the first two, right? These are direct quotes, by the way. "Religious humanists regard the universe as self-existing and not created." Okay. The second tenet, humanism believes man is part of nature and that he has emerged as the result of a continuous process. We're talking here about evolution, right? So, right off the bat, the Humanist Manifesto is brazenly taking aim at some of the most fundamental doctrines held not just by Christians, but by many other religious organizations, movements, and groups as well. Even Jews and Islam regard the universe as created, right? Even Hindus regard the universe as created. So this is a somewhat new worldview. But right now, this doesn't sound all that radical to people in America because we've kind of been like a fish swimming in water. We've kind of lived in an environment that's just saturated with these ideas. But when this was published in 1933, this was extremely radical. Probably 95+% of Americans would have described themselves as Christian at that time. And so I want to just for a moment compare these things here that John Dewey and his cohorts are saying in the Humanist Manifesto. So let's start with the first. Religious humanists regard the universe as self-existing and not created. Well, what does the Word of God say? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So anybody who thinks that was an accident, that the first plank of the Humanist Manifesto also takes aim at the very first words in the scripture, doesn't understand the humanists, right? They did that very deliberately, very strategically. This was their way of telling the world, hey, your whole book is a fraud, right? Starting with literally the first 4 or 5 letters in your book. We reject all of that, right? Now, even if you're not a Bible believing Christian, and I think you should be, if you're not, talk to me later. Eternity depends on it. But even if you're not, our political system is actually based on the fact that we were created, that the universe was created, and that our creator endowed us with certain unalienable rights. And these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This is just a different way of restating the biblical truths, right? God said he gave you a right to life when he said, thou shalt not murder. God said he gave you a right to property when he said, thou shalt not steal. God said the government must help you protect those God-given rights when he established civil government to punish evil, as he says repeatedly in the scripture. Romans 13 being probably the premier example. So if you believe this false religion that John Dewey and his cohorts propagated under the guise of the Humanist Manifesto, you reject, of course, the self-evident truth that we are created and that our Creator endowed us with unalienable rights. And you also reject the very foundation of everything we read in the Scriptures. The fact that in the beginning, God, right? In the beginning, God. They reject all of that. Now, another one of the signers of this document, and this will go back to what I was saying about public schools before we dig back into the Humanist Manifesto, C.F. Potter, one of the signers of this Humanist Manifesto, he wrote in his book, Humanism, A New Religion, that education is the most powerful ally of humanism. Every school is a school of humanism. What is your theistic Sunday school meeting for an hour once a week and teaching only a fraction of the children going to do to stem the tide of 5 days of humanistic teachings? And of course, the answer, as they all understood, was nothing, right? And I should pause here and point out, I do not believe Christian education will save your children. Jesus Christ saves your children, not Christian education. But we are commanded to raise up our children in the fear, discipline, nurture, and admonition of the Lord, not to hand them over to humanists for discipling in the ways of the world. Humanists still say this stuff today. In 1983, in the Humanist magazine, John Dunphy wrote that the classroom is going to be the arena of conflict between the old and the new, the rotting corpse of Christianity, together with its adjacent evils and misery, and the new faith of humanism. So before we dig any deeper into the Humanist Manifesto, I want us to just pause and think about what we have heard so far. Right? In the humanist worldview, there is no God. You are God, right? You will determine, we as a collective will determine what is right and wrong. Okay? Forget God, forget God's rules. We are God, I am God, you are God, and we will determine what is good, what is evil. We will determine how man must be saved, and generally they believe man is saved through government programs and education. And if this is sounding familiar, it should be, because if you just go 2 chapters ahead in Genesis, you get to Genesis chapter 3, and you read Satan telling Eve that your eyes will be opened if you defy God, and ye shall be as gods, knowing good and evil. Right? So this is really just a repackaged version of the oldest lie in the book, the lie that we shall be as gods, knowing good and evil, if we just question or reject the commands of our Creator. It's a lie from the pit of hell. And when I say that, when Jesus said, that you're either with him or against him. I think this is a really good example of what I'm talking about. All you got to do is scratch just right beneath the surface, and you'll find, boom, lies from the pit of hell. Right? And of course, I don't think most humanists necessarily see themselves as Satanists, but I think when you really break down their doctrine, when you really look at their documents and what they believe, this is just a repackaged version of the same lies from the pit of hell that our ancestors dealt with literally in the garden. Right? So, how did it come to be the dominant religion in the United States? Which I say that unequivocally, right? Yes, most Americans still identify as Christian, but most Americans also, their worldview is far more in line with the humanist worldview than it is with the Christian worldview. And at best, now, if you look at the data that George Barna has put out, that the Nehemiah Foundation puts out, we're dealing with syncretism, where there's some bizarre blend of humanism and Christianity. And even the people who still recognize there is a creator, their moral values, their way of looking at the world, a lot of it comes just straight out of the Humanist Manifesto. So what happened was in 1962, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that we could not have prayer in schools. They said this prayer was a violation of the First Amendment. Now, I should remind you, this prayer was as non-sectarian as could be. It was actually a rabbi, a Protestant minister, and a Catholic priest who came up with this prayer. And it was very simple. Almighty God, we acknowledge our dependence upon thee, and we beg thy blessings upon us, our parents, our teachers, and our country. Amen. Supreme Court said that was a violation of the First Amendment. Anybody who's read the First Amendment knows that is patently ridiculous, right? This was a case against the state of New York. The First Amendment, if you've read it, clearly starts off with Congress shall make no law, right? Is the state of New York Congress? And no, it's not a trick question, right? No, the state of New York is not Congress. Therefore, the First Amendment was not written to restrain the state of New York. In fact, when the First Amendment was written and ratified, most of our states had established churches. And I will not argue in favor of an established church. I think it's a bad idea. But the idea that the First Amendment was intended to prevent schools in New York from teaching the Bible or prayer to children is totally ludicrous. And it shows you how dumbed down we had been by the time we got to 1962, that the Supreme Court, a majority of the Supreme Court, could rule that prayer in school was unconstitutional. And probably most people understood that was silly, but not clearly enough to stop it. And the very next year, they went even further. They said no more Bible reading in school. This was a case against a school district in Pennsylvania, the Abington School District, and really incredible case. And so I want to go now to the dissent in this case. It was written by Justice Potter Stewart, and he put out something very, very interesting in here. He said the refusal to permit religious exercises thus is seen not as the realization of state neutrality, but rather as the establishment of a religion of secularism. In other words, under the guise of Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, the Supreme Court established a national religion. The only problem was it wasn't true religion. It wasn't based on the Bible. It was based on the Humanist Manifesto. Now, Potter Stewart called it secularism, but that's just another way of saying humanism, right? And it is a religion. In fact, John Dewey and his cohorts admitted in the Humanist Manifesto that this was a religion, and federal courts have repeatedly ruled that humanism is a religion. And I would argue it takes far more faith to believe something as silly as the universe is self-existing and not created than it does to recognize the very obvious evidence of creation that is literally all around us. So let's continue in the Humanist Manifesto. Before we even get to the economic components of this, I want to read to you guys some of the other planks. And we could go through the thing piece by piece, but in the interest of time, we'll just focus on a few. In the sixth plank, they say, we are convinced that the time has passed for theism, deism, modernism, and the several varieties of new thought. So not only was this a war on Christianity, this was a declaration of war even on theism, right? Even on the belief in God, or deism, the belief that there is a God, maybe not the biblical God, but a God who created stuff, right? The time for that, they say, has passed. We're done with that. The eighth plank of the Humanist Manifesto, I'm going to read it word for word. Religious humanism considers the complete realization of human personality to be the end of man's life and seeks its development and fulfillment in the here and now. This is the explanation of the humanist social passion. So very interesting, right? The humanists have a very clear view on what the purpose of life is. And they're not shy about telling you what it is. They believe the purpose of life is to, I'm going to read it again here, is to achieve the complete realization of human personality, right? And I don't think you have to be a Presbyterian to really appreciate the Westminster Confession. I'm going to pull that up real quick so that I don't butcher it. But the very first question in there is, what is the chief end of man, right? And some of you probably recognize that, the chief end of man. And for some reason I can't find my thing right now. But the chief end of man is to glorify God and enjoy Him forever, right? So Christians have a very clear understanding of what our purpose is. It is to glorify God and enjoy Him forever. Humanists also have a very clear purpose of what the purpose of life is. They have a clear vision on this. Their view is that it is the complete realization of human personality. If you go down to the 10th plank, they say there will be no uniquely religious emotions and attitudes of the kind hitherto associated with belief in the supernatural. Okay. They go on.
Alex,
Yes.
I don't know if you're advancing your slides or I mean, if you mean to be advancing your slides, but we're still seeing a quote from Justice Potter Stewart.
Oh, thank you, Terry. I didn't have slides with some of these others, so I'll go forward in just a moment. But thank you for letting me know.
Okay,
Appreciate it.
okay.
Yep. And so I've got one more out of the Humanist Manifesto, and then we'll go back to the slideshow. It says religious humanism maintains that all associations and institutions exist for the fulfillment of human life. The intelligent evaluation, transformation, control, and direction of such associations and institutions with a view to the enhancement of human life is the purpose and program of humanism. Okay, and unless there's any doubt about what he's saying here, right? He's talking about the church too. Certainly, they continue, religious institutions, their ritualistic forms, ecclesiastical methods, and communal activities must be reconstituted as rapidly as experience allows in order to function effectively in the modern world. So I hope that's clear. It would be hard for them to have been more clear. This is an absolute declaration of war on the church, on Christians, on the Bible, and on the worldview that Christians hold. Now, continuing, also in the Humanist Manifesto, we read their program for the economy. The humanists are firmly convinced that the existing acquisitive and profit motive society has shown itself to be inadequate and that a radical change in methods, controls, and motives must be instituted. So they believe that the profit motive is inadequate. So they're talking here about the free market system. And, I taught economics for 12 years. I think it's very easy to show from the Bible that God's intended and proper economic system is really a free market system. He instituted private property when he said, "Thou shalt not steal." He instituted a prohibition on fraud when he prohibited unjust weights and measures. In fact, even when it comes to welfare, in 2 Thessalonians, I believe it says, "Whoever does not work should not eat." Right? And of course, that doesn't apply to widows and the people who otherwise cannot support themselves. Then Christians as individuals and we collectively as the church have an obligation to step in. But they're also declaring war here on the economic system that reigned in the United States at that time, the free market system, and calling for a new system. And if you notice here, we need a radical change in methods, controls, and motives. And they actually get into even more detail on this. They go on to say that a socialized and cooperative economic order must be established to the end that equitable distribution of the means of life be possible. Means of life is another way of saying the means of production. And so if this is starting to sound like Marxism, good, it should, because that is what we're dealing with here. They're talking about socializing property, socializing the wealth, socializing the means of production, and then having equitable distribution of that. So government control over the means of production. Now, there have been several new and improved Humanist Manifestos that have been released over the years. There was a Humanist Manifesto 2 that actually gets even more radical than the original Humanist Manifesto. It came out 40 years later in 1973. And very, very openly starts calling for globalism, very, very openly starts calling for the undermining of the nation state, etc. The second plank of the Second Humanist Manifesto, really direct, blatant attack on the church, on Jesus Christ, on salvation. I'm going to read you the first sentence. Promises of immortal salvation or fear of eternal damnation are both illusory and harmful. Okay? Your belief in eternal salvation through Christ is not just a fiction. Okay, it's a harmful fiction. So these people feel perfectly justified in taking your children and brainwashing them with their religion because they think your view is harmful to your children. They go on to say that these promises of immortal salvation, fear of eternal damnation, distract humans from present concerns, from self actualization, and from rectifying social injustice. They go on to say that modern science discredits such historic concepts. And science affirms that the human species is an emergence from natural evolutionary forces. So, folks, this is a total war. They go on to say traditional religions are surely not the only obstacles to human progress. So your religious views are an obstacle to progress. There are other ideologies that also impede human advance, it says. For example, some of the worst features of orthodoxy they talk about. So, yeah, pretty amazing, folks. And then the Humanist Manifesto 3, just as blatant in its condemnation of Christianity, just as blatant in its call for a total restructuring of society. And so, with that, I could go on and on about humanism, and I could go on and on about how the public school system has really made this the dominant worldview in America. I could talk about some of the other founders of the public school system. We could go back to Robert Owen. We could look at Horace Mann, who actually described himself as a Unitarian. The parallels between Unitarianism and humanism are very obvious. In fact, many of the signers of the first Humanist Manifesto describe themselves as Unitarian ministers. Some of them even call themselves reverend, but they're reverends in the Unitarian Church, which I don't think you can properly call it a church. So that's what I've got to share with you guys. Happy to take questions, but I hope it's very clear here that we're dealing with not just a false view, but a false religion from the pit of hell that is very dangerous and that is very evangelistic. Not in the sense of going from door to door preaching the good news of no salvation, but in the sense of trying to disciple your children into this very, very harmful worldview. So with that, I've been blabbering for half an hour now. I will stop and I'll hand it back to you, Terry, if you guys have questions or want to discuss anything further.
Well, thank you, Alex. That was great.
Thank you.
Um, I had a question about Frederick Gates.
Sure.
Is that related to Bill Gates?
That's a good question. Not that I know of, but it's a small world. And, when you look at Bill Gates' father, one of the founders of Planned Parenthood, one of the board members of Planned Parenthood, you look at Margaret Sanger, the founder of Planned Parenthood, very, very closely associated with these humanist luminaries, including a lot of the progressives around John Dewey. There's a lot of links there. So it wouldn't surprise me, but as far as I know, no.
Oh, um, now this is probably this is outside the realm of your talk right now, but I have heard that Bill Gates' dad was on a part of Planned Parenthood. When was that?
He was on the board of Planned Parenthood, actually, and that would have been, I think, back in the 1970s or 1980s. So yeah, that was some time ago. But yeah, and Bill Gates has actually talked about that, how his dad believed very strongly in population control, and you find that a lot with the humanists. They think they know better than what the Bible teaches, and God said, "Be fruitful and multiply." Well, the humanists think that they know better, and that there are too many of us, and so eugenics is very, very common among these people. And I didn't mention, and I probably should have, because there's a really strong nexus here. The first leader of UNESCO, which is the UN Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, that's the main UN education agency. The first leader of this was Julian Huxley, who was also the head of the British Humanist Society and also the British Eugenics Association. So at every area within the education system that you look at, you find eugenicists, you find humanists, oftentimes in the same person, and UNESCO is, of course, no exception.
So those UNESCO World Heritage Sites, I see that like we were in South Africa in September, and there's a lot of places in South Africa that are dedicated UNESCO sites. How is that associated to um, the Huxley thing?
So UNESCO World Heritage Sites, we actually have a lot of them here in the United States, which in my opinion is an atrocity. I actually just did a talk in South Georgia a few months ago because they're trying to declare the Okefenokee Swamp to be a UNESCO World Heritage Site. So I know quite a bit about these. So the UNESCO agency deals with several different areas. Education is its primary focus, hence the E, but they also deal with science and they also deal with culture. And so UNESCO World Heritage Sites are sites of supposedly very important international value. And so they take things like monuments, Yellowstone National Park, for example, which is a natural heritage site, is also a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Um,
It is?
Yes, Yellowstone National Park is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. We have a lot of them in the United States, and things that you would never believe, like the Alamo, right? How could they make the Alamo, right? The guys who fought and died there would be turning over in their graves. But yes, we got a lot of UNESCO World Heritage Sites in our country, and that is one of the many programs that UNESCO is known for. In fact, they're probably better known for their World Heritage Site program than they are for their education initiatives. Although I would argue their education initiatives are infinitely more important than their World Heritage Site designations.
Thank you. Okay,
Mhm.
Terry, sorry about that. I just
Oh
had this
no,
question.
that's okay. I have a couple of questions that are going to be kind of long. So I'm going to ask you, and then I'm going to turn off my camera while you talk about it.
Sure.
So the first one is we've been hearing a lot about all of the things that Trump is doing, the executive orders and everything. And one of them is related to school choice. So I know that you and a couple other prominent homeschool speakers have talked about why school choice, although it might seem like a good thing, is really not. So can you explain that?
Yeah, really good question, and it actually is directly related to this through UNESCO. So I'll get to that part in a moment. But I think first it's important we define our terms, right? I am the most pro school choice person that you could possibly imagine, although I don't believe you should have the choice to loot your neighbor's money and fund indoctrination of children into evil worldviews like humanism. So I'm not in favor of that kind of choice. I don't believe that's a legitimate choice. But as far as parents choosing how they want their children to be educated, I'm as firm a believer in school choice as a person could ever be. But usually, when people talk about school choice today, it's actually a very carefully crafted marketing slogan. And what they mean is government funded and government controlled choice. So to be clear, we have school choice in every one of the 50 states. Right now, no matter which state you live in, unless you have some kind of weird court order because of a nasty divorce or something, you can choose as a parent to send your child to a government indoctrination camp. You can choose to send your child to a Catholic parochial school, to a Lutheran school, to a Hindu school, to a madrasa. You can choose to homeschool them. You can homeschool them in almost any way you would like. You can choose to unschool them in virtually every one of our states if you choose to do that. So we have essentially unlimited school choice in this country right now. And so the hijacking of the term school choice, I think, in and of itself is very nefarious. That is the term that they use, but we need to be clear. We already have school choice. We don't need a new law to give us choice. In fact, what these laws are actually designed to do, and this is going to be controversial, but it's absolutely true, is designed to obliterate real choice. And I can prove that. I have a UNESCO document in my possession. Again, UNESCO is the UN Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, where in 2022, it's the Global Education Monitoring Report. It's called Non-State Education Providers: An Equity Perspective. What they argue is that there has been a proliferation of non-government education options around the world in the form of private schools, homeschools, Christian schools, etc. And they see this as very problematic because they're not following government curricula. The children are, in many cases, not taking government tests. There are no, in many cases, anti-discrimination measures. So if a school chooses that they don't want to hire a Hindu teacher for their Christian school, they're allowed to do that. If a school chooses that they're not going to let a guy wearing a dress teach the kindergarten class, they're allowed to do that. If a school chooses they don't want to admit non-Christians, they're allowed to do that. So UNESCO sees all that as very problematic. And what they call for in this document is for governments to start funding with tax money all of these non-state education providers. So the private schools, the homeschools, Christian schools, etc. And they're very clear about the reason why. So I think we need to think of the money like cheese in the mousetrap, right? The mouse looks at it and smells it and thinks, "Ooh, that'll be delicious," and he doesn't realize that it's in a trap. So the same thing is going to happen now with school choice. And one of the reasons I know how this ends is because I saw the end game. I was living in Sweden before coming back to the United States, not on purpose. Wife is from there. And so in Sweden, they passed in 1999, I believe it was, the first ever universal school choice bill anywhere in the world. And if you know about Sweden, you know it's kind of like a test market. Even big companies, they'll try out new products there. And a lot of the crazy policies that the evildoers want to promote, they try them out in Sweden first to try to see how are people going to respond, what's the opposition going to look like. One of the reasons why is Swedes are very compliant. Another reason why is that what happens in Sweden typically stays in Sweden. Very few people outside of Sweden, almost none, speak Swedish. And so, you know, if something shows up in the Swedish newspaper, not a lot of people outside of the 10 million Swedes who live there are going to even know about it. So 1999, they passed this universal school choice, and my wife and I were living there in 2011 when the trap actually shut. And so in that intervening 12-year period, every single private school in Sweden decided to take the free government money. There was one school that did not take it. That was the school for the aristocrats. Yes, Sweden still has an aristocracy. They still have a nobility, and they still have a king. And so the aristocrat school decided not to take the money. I don't know if they knew what was coming or if they just didn't need it or what. But in 2011, they passed the Education Reform Act, and they said every school that is taking public money, which at that point was now every school in the country, even all the private schools, must teach the government curriculum, which, by the way, in first grade, children were required to learn that gender is a social construct, homosexuality is good and wholesome, all this kind of stuff. And anyone who, by the way, the Jewish schools were not allowed to operate as they were operating. The Christian schools, they had to ban prayer. They had to ban the Bible. You literally could not have Bible and prayer in a Christian school anymore. They banned homeschooling as well. No more homeschooling. And so I saw where this is going. And frankly, we're seeing it now in the United States. I could give you a whole nother talk on that, but even the government itself admits that this is what's going on. Let me end my slideshow here, and I'll grab a couple of those pieces of evidences. School choice. So the U.S. Government Accountability Office, the GAO, did a very comprehensive study in 2016. Here it is. And here's what they concluded. The study was called "Private School Choice Programs Are Growing and Can Complicate Providing Certain Federally Funded Services to Eligible Students." And so in their study, this is what they found. This is in their executive summary. Voucher and ESA programs generally placed some requirements on participating private schools, according to GAO's review of program documents, survey responses, and interviews with program officials. And some of the examples of those requirements were mandatory government testing, mandatory data gathering by government, mandatory admissions criteria and non-discrimination and civil rights things. And so to some people, that means, well, what's wrong with making them take tests, right? What's wrong with gathering the data? I want to just be really, really clear here. Bill Gates has said this publicly too. And by the way, Bill Gates is one of the largest financiers of the school choice movement. That should tell you everything you need to know. But testing drives what is taught, always and everywhere. This will be true in state schools. This will be true in private schools. This will be true in homeschools. If you know that your child is going to be taking a particular test, you want your child to do well on that test, and so you're going to adjust what you teach and how you teach based on what's on that test. And so that's why when people say, "Oh, it's no big deal. Yeah, take the money. Then all we have to do is take a test." The test drives what is taught. And the restrictions will continue to increase, by the way. Arizona became the first state to adopt universal school choice just a couple years ago. Guess what? They have a Democrat governor right now, and she is openly declaring that all private schools that take this government money must impose government tests, must use the same high quality standards that the public schools are using. And so, folks, I want to warn you in the strongest possible terms that this is a trap. And it pains me to say that because the vast majority of the people pushing this in state legislatures are people who I agree with on most things. One positive thing I will say is I'm encouraged that we're now talking about how do we get kids out of the public schools instead of how do we reform the public schools. That's a good development. But school choice, so-called government-funded, government-controlled school choice, is a trap. It is being funded by very nefarious forces, again, including Bill Gates is one of the biggest funders of this movement. Frankly, we already have school choice. What we need to do is protect our independence.
Okay, so I have a couple of follow-up questions. So President Trump seems to be working hard against the globalists, against this kind of an agenda for the most part. He also seems, whether or not he's saved, we don't know for sure, but he seems to have a respect for the things of the Lord. So why is he pushing so hard for this? Like, why haven't you talked? I know you've met him. Like, How come he doesn't have people speaking this kind of wisdom to him about school choice?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and I wish I had a good answer for it. I know he has heard some of these concerns. One of the big problems is that he's got a lot of people around him who have given him a lot of money, who are full on into the school choice thing. And one really, really good example of that is Betsy DeVos. The reason she ended up as the Secretary of Education in the first term is because her family, and her in particular, gave massive amounts of money to the campaign. Now, Betsy DeVos was the savior of Common Core in the state of Michigan. And actually, since we're talking about this, I want to show you a quick little video. I think I have it handy. Um, yes, let me show you this real quick, because I think it will show you everything you need to know about the people around Trump who are pushing this. And you know, again, with all due respect to Mr. Trump, I do appreciate very much what he's been doing. I think he's very wrong on this. But let me see. All right, here we go. Share sound. All right, so hopefully you guys can see this now. Do you guys see my PowerPoint thing here?
Yes, we see the program, the PowerPoint program.
Okay, perfect. That's good enough. So let me click play on this video here. And so this is Betsy DeVos, the Secretary of Education during the first Trump administration, saying something very profound.
So let's stop and rethink the definition of public education. Today, it's often defined as one type of school funded by taxpayers, controlled by government. But if every student is part of the public, then every way and every place a student learns is ultimately of benefit to the public. That should be the new definition of public education.
What? Okay, so my homeschool is now also public education. And so, you know, I know a lot of the people around Trump who are working on these things. Some of them are friends. I respect them greatly. But I think they are very wrong on this. I think most of them, they're looking frantically for ways to get kids out of the public schools. And this looks like a lifeline. But my friend E. Ray Moore has a very clever phrase that he uses to describe this. And he says, this is really the equivalent of killing the goose that lays the golden egg to get a chicken sandwich, right? The goose that lays the golden egg is the incredible ecosystem we have right now in home education and Christian education. We've got millions and millions of families being educated in the system. And so we're going to kill that goose that lays the golden egg that produces God-fearing, godly, conservative Christian voters and active citizens and entrepreneurs and stuff, so that we can get a chicken sandwich, so that we can get a few more kids out of the system right now. We're going to lose all of that independence we have. So, I'm hoping to have the opportunity. I've been asked actually to come to DC and meet with some of these folks and share my concerns. There's a number of different proposals right now at the federal level. I think some are less bad than others. You know, there's one that would allow people to get a tax credit if they if they choose not to use the government school system. And even that, I think, is dangerous territory, but that's certainly much better than having the money go to Washington, D.C., and then come back to me with strings attached. So if we do get some kind of action on this, which I think is within the realm of possibility at least, I hope we end up with one of the less bad measures rather than the full-blown, you know, vouchers for everybody. You know, conservatives understood universal health care is bad. Universal basic income, oh no, please no, that's a terrible idea. But somehow universal government funding for education is like, yeah, what? Guys, show me in the Bible where it says that the government ought to be taking money from people to educate people's children. It's just not in there. So I think it's a bad policy, and I wish I had a better explanation for why Trump was on this bandwagon. I wish he would stop, but we'll see where it goes. So.
think I think at the root of it, there's a lot of people who don't like that their tax money is going to fund public schools. So getting it back for them, for the homeschoolers or the, you know, school choice people who are buying into this. This is what I'm assuming, and maybe you could speak to it, but you know, as a taxpayer, if my money is going to fund all of these things, the homosexual agenda in the public schools and everything else, then oh yay, we get some of that back. So is there a way that people can advocate for not having to pay into that at all in the first place? Like, wouldn't that be a better approach? And is that something that as citizens, like, we could work on? Like, Are there tips?
Excellent question, Terry. I love that. And actually, that was my thought. I actually met with our governor here in Florida, Ron DeSantis, and proposed that we do that. In 2023, they passed HB1, which was the next big universal school choice after Arizona. And we fought really, really hard against this. We were talking about it a little bit before we started the program today. We created an incredible coalition here in Florida, fought really hard. We did make the final bill that passed significantly less bad than the original bill, but it was still very bad. So what I proposed to our governor, and what I've proposed to policymakers across the country, I've met with senior legislative leaders on education committees in multiple states and proposed this, is exactly what you just described, Terry. If I don't use the government school system, I should not have to pay for the government school system. Now, every state's got a slightly different tax system. Here in Florida, we don't have income taxes, right? So our government schools here are funded by property taxes. So what I proposed to the governor was a very simple system. Every year, everybody in Florida gets a little postcard if you own your house. And on that postcard, you have some little boxes. Are you a widow? Are you retired law enforcement? Are you, a former veteran? Do you have commercial agricultural activities on your property? Is this your primary residence? And the more boxes you tick, the lower your property tax bill gets. So I said, why don't you just add one more box on there? I have school-age children, and I choose not to use the local brainwash camp, right? Boom, presto. And then whatever segment of your taxes was supposed to go to the public school system is immediately eliminated from your tax bill. And so in my case, that would be more than 50% of my tax bill would be instantly eliminated. And that would allow me to save a few $1,000s a year. And I think that's fantastic. Under the current system, and I do hear that argument a lot, Terry. Well, the government's already taken my money. Why shouldn't I get it back? Here in Florida, we have this so-called universal school choice thing. I could get $8,000 per child. I've got 6 children. So, math is not my forte today, but that works out to, $50,000 a year almost that I could be getting if I decided to take this money. I don't pay $50,000 a year in taxes to the state of Florida and to the county that I live in. Not even close. So what I'm really doing here is I'm taking money from my neighbors. And I've got elderly neighbors who are on a fixed income living on Social Security. Explain to me in what universe it's just for me to take money from them that they worked for to have my kids brainwashed. It's just not right, in my opinion. And so the Bible verse that comes to mind here for me comes out of Matthew chapter 5, right? Starting in verse 41. If a soldier demands that you carry his gear for a mile, carry it 2 miles, okay? So I don't like having to pay taxes for the government school system. I'm trying to build a farm right now. We just got our building permit yesterday, as a matter of fact. And on that, if I want to pick up my permit, I've got to give them $20,000. The vast majority of that comes from impact fees. The biggest single item on the impact fees is public schools. Well, I've got 6 kids. Not one of them will ever see the inside of a public school, and still I've got to pay an arm and a leg for schools that I will never use. So I agree with you, Terry. The best system, in my opinion, would be one where taxpayers who have children and do not use the public schools can keep their money, right? Not have it go to Tallahassee and then come back to me, not have it to go to Washington, D.C. and come back to me. Just let me keep it. And it's a very simple thing to do on the federal income tax. Just, put a deduction on the state property tax bill. Just, check an extra box. We've already got a whole bunch of boxes, so it'd be a very simple thing to implement. That's what I proposed. I was told that they didn't think they'd be able to get that through. We did get a bill introduced on this in Missouri. It was a little bit complicated, unfortunately, because there are people who rent their houses as well, and so there was a complicated formula that did not end up being signed into law, although I met with the chairman of the Education Committee there in the Senate, and I really thought it was a good idea. I thought it needed some work. But anyways, long story short, Terry, I think it's a great idea, and I think that is what we should pursue. If we choose not to use the public schools, we should not have to pay for them.
Okay, next question. So I know Florida, like every state has its own opportunities for homeschooling. And that's why, organizations like the HSLDA, where you can go and you can read specifically about your state and the opportunities the ways that you can legally homeschool within each state. Like, so Florida has something called PEP, I believe. And then like here in California, we have public charter schools. So when I was a homeschooling mom and as a continuing homeschool tutor, I always have the option that I could coordinate or partner with the public charter schools, which means as a parent, I would get money from the state to pay for things. Like I see some of my Christian friends who participate in this and they're like, but we get money so that we can pay for our curriculum. We get money so that we can pay for lessons. We get money so that we can go on field trips to Disneyland. Don't get me started. But as a homeschool tutor, I also could register with these schools, and I could get much more money. I could get paid much more than if I charge families directly. I have never done that, and the primary thing why I chose as a parent and why I choose as a tutor to not participate is it is the regulation and is also the legally you're not supposed to, you're supposed to use non-sectarian curriculum. So I knew that as a Christian I wanted to make sure I was teaching my son the Bible and teaching him about God in every single subject, not just, adding a Bible curriculum to my secular curriculum. And also as a tutor, it's the same thing. Like even math, like I have a quote from Dr. Lyle on my classroom wall that says, math is the way God thinks about numbers. And every subject that I teach, we talk about God. And so I will never do that. But there's a lot of Christians in California and probably in other states who have similar programs that are participating in this. So do you have some words of encouragement to support them in making that tough decision to not be lured by the money, and why it's so important to choose to do it independently or through a Christian private PSP or ISP?
Yeah, and I think you just hit on some of the really important arguments. And even if the regulations are not yet intolerable, there are restrictions and regulations, and they're going to be getting worse. So I think one of the biggest problems with this money opening up, and in a lot of states we don't have all these regulations yet, is that they're creating an incredible sense of dependency. And what's going to happen is once the regulations come, it's going to be then impossible to disentangle ourselves. And we've seen that already in Florida. Almost all the private Christian schools now are heavily dependent on government money, either through Hope scholarships or through now this new PEP program. And so what has happened is these schools that are dependent on it, they've hired new staff, et cetera. And just a few years ago, it was like in unison, all the big newspapers across the state started agitating against these Christian schools because they weren't teaching enough LGBT and transgender and all the rest of it. They said, hey, these schools are getting public money. You need to do something. And there was very serious talk about cracking down. Florida will probably be one of the later ones to fall. But what will happen when those regulations come? What if it could be a federal court ruling? It could be a Democrat governor imposing new regulations. Are those schools going to be willing to say, well, now you're going to require us to teach LGBT to kids? Well, in that case, we're going to fire 50% of our staff, and we're going to default on our mortgage, and we're going to, that's not going to happen. Realistically, the schools are going to be forced to compromise. And what they've also done very successfully now is they've fractured the unity that we had in the homeschool movement. Before this year, every major national homeschool organization and almost every major state homeschool organization was united in opposition to government funding for home education. Now that we've got more and more homeschoolers across the country getting hooked on the government money, the unity that we once had has fractured. And so once they come in to regulate us, they won't distinguish between those who are taking the money and those who are not. And we will be broken. And, just like Jesus said, kingdom divided against itself cannot stand. Well, that's where we're headed. And I think that was one of the strategic reasons why they did this at the highest level. Not your average lawmaker who voted for it, but the people behind the scenes pushing it. So there's a lot of good reasons why we want to try to avoid this money. Biblical reasons, pragmatic reasons. But in the long term, again, just think of it like the cheese in the mousetrap. It only looks free and delicious. It may be delicious, but there's always going to be a cost. So.
Okay, so next week in our two-part series, Leilani Melendez will be coming and talking to us more about homeschooling and how secularism is creeping in. And so I think we're like right there bordering on that. So before you go, we have two more questions about public schools in general. First of all, Steve would like to know if getting rid of the Department of Education is going to be a good thing, and if it really is going to happen.
It would be an amazing thing, but it's not going to happen. And I hate to be the bearer of bad news. A lot of people think it has happened already. It hasn't, and Trump did lay off about half of the staff, and of course that's a very good start. But if you actually look at the executive order he signed, if you look at the legislation in Congress, all of it simply redistributes these functions to other agencies. They talk about shifting the responsibility back to the states. The state is probably better than federal, although why should the state be in charge of our education? But what they have really done here, and Trump has said this publicly, by the way, and so has Linda McMahon. They have publicly said we are redistributing the functions of the Federal Department of Education to other agencies. So all the things having to do with health and nutrition, those are all going to HHS. All the things having to do with civil rights are going to the DOJ. All the things having to do with international programs are going to the State Department. All the things having to do with career training are going to the Department of Labor. All the things having to do with the Indian tribes are going to the Department of Interior. So in a way, this actually makes it more difficult to track. So he's also going to need support from Congress, which I don't think he's going to have. We've got a very, very thin Republican majority, and once you factor in the fact that a huge percentage of those Republicans are what we call rhinos, Republican in name only, they do not have a majority to even cut the funding, much less abolish the department. There are a few bills that would do this. Congressman Thomas Massie has, I think, the best one. It's very simple. Shut down the Department of Education. It's done. No more money, no more nothing. And I've interviewed him about that. People can see why he advocates that approach. I think it's the right approach, but that's not going to pass. The bill by Senator Mike Rounds, read the bill. It just redistributes all the functions to other agencies, literally. And it says that this function will go to this agency, this function will go to that agency. So the Department of Education is totally unconstitutional, and it's a terrible idea. I love that Trump is talking about this. I love that he's trying to do the right thing and shut it down. But just being realistic, I don't think it's going to happen. And best case scenario, maybe it'll lose a little bit of its funding and a little bit of its authority. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't be pushing for it. We need to ultimately be pushing for our federal government to obey the Constitution that created it and allows it to exist. And I would argue that we need to move the Overton window. We don't just want the U.S. Department of Education out of our children's education. We want state departments of education out of our children's education. And then we want local government out of our children's education. But at least we're moving in the right direction. So praise the Lord.
Well, and speaking of that, so I've seen some headlines now. Every state is different in their approaches and obviously their culture. I'm in California, which is, sometimes feels hopeless, but I've seen some of the more conservative states are now initiating measures or they've actually like put them into place that they have to bring the Bible back into public schools and they have to start there were some different things that I saw that were very encouraging. I think even teaching creation in one of the states, they're starting to teach, mandate that the kids get to learn both sides at least. Are you familiar with some of those laws, and is that something that we should be encouraged by, or
I am familiar with some of those laws. In fact, I interviewed Secretary of Education or Superintendent of Education Ryan Walters of Oklahoma for the Liberty Pastors Program just maybe a few months ago. He's actually the leader on this front. He has mandated that Bibles now be brought back into the classroom in defiance of that crazy Supreme Court ruling we mentioned earlier. And I think it's a very good idea. The problem is the system itself is built on unbiblical foundations. And so, this is a good stopgap measure. Yes, these kids need to learn the Bible. Unfortunately, there are not a lot of teachers that are going to teach it well. They've been through a 4-year education program at some state college that taught them humanism. And so, and a lot of the teachers are laughing about this. Yeah, we'll teach the Bible. Just wait, right? It's going to be great. Yeah, I think that's a great thing. Arkansas just passed a bill to put the Ten Commandments in the classroom. Louisiana just passed a law last year to put the Ten Commandments back in the classroom. Again, in total defiance of the Supreme Court, which I think is great. And we need to do that. There are kids in there who need to know the truth. And unfortunately, right now, they're not getting it. So some Bible is better than no Bible. Bible taught by a bad teacher is better than Bible taught by no teacher. But really, I think we need to think way bigger than that. We need to get back to a biblical understanding of education. We need to understand that it's a parental responsibility, not a government responsibility, and that God is ultimately going to hold each of us as moms and dads accountable for the decisions we make with respect to the education of our children. And so, yeah, I do think those are great, Terry. But I would never in a million years say to a parent in Oklahoma, "Hey, they got the Bible back in public school. You should send little Johnny." It wouldn't cross my mind. So.
That makes sense. All right. Well, we're at the end of our public time, so we're going to go ahead and end our recording and live stream. But first, can you just remind everybody about your work, the Liberty Sentinel, and the other things that you do?
Thank you so much, Terry. Really appreciate it. So Liberty Sentinel is my journalism operation. You can find us at libertysentinel.org. We do a free newsletter. You can sign up there. Twice a week goes out. We'll never sell your data, and all kinds of stuff, not just education, but China, the UN, the environment, the Bible, what's going on with the Great Commission, all kinds of fun stuff. So we definitely encourage you to sign up for that. Again, totally free. A lot of our education stuff you'll find at Public School Exit, publicschoolexit.com. I do have a new book on education. If you're interested in this topic, and I hope you will because I think it's the most important topic of all, my new book is Indoctrinating Our Children to Death, Government Schools' War on Faith, Family, and Freedom, and How to Stop It. Some really great people were kind enough to work with me on this. Kirk Cameron endorsed it, Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, General Michael Flynn, National Security Advisor. Actually, the foreword was written by the state superintendent of all the public schools in Arizona until 2020. Great lady, and agrees with me. We've got to shut down this system. So that people can get that at my website or Amazon or anywhere good books are sold. I keep my kids in classical conversations. I'm a senior fellow there. Encourage people to check that out if you've got homeschool age children. I'm also on the board of the Freedom Project Academy. I'm a senior editor at the New American magazine. If you're not yet checking that out, go to thenewamerican.com. And wow, I could go on, but those are some of the big things that I do. And of course, you can follow me on social media as well. And thank you again so much, Terry, for what you do, and thank you all for coming tonight. It's a great honor to be here with you, and I hope I had something of value to offer you.
Oh, most definitely. And we are Creation Fellowship Santee, and you can see a list of our upcoming speakers by going to tinyurl.com/CF Santee, C like creation, F like fellowship, Santee is spelled Santee. And join us again next week as we come back for the second part of this two-part series on secular humanism. Tonight, Alex focused on the public school agenda, but next week we have Leilani Melendez with us, who will be talking about how secular trends are showing up in homeschooling. So with that, we're going to go ahead and end our live stream and recording for tonight.